Right, well, this is by way of thanks to the AYRS for all the inspiration and help they've given me. I grew up on the shore of Lake Windermere at Fell Foot, at the south end of the lake, which is a National Trust park now. My father was warden there, and so boats were part of my life from age 7 onwards, when I was allowed to row the family rowing boat up and down between the piers, and was later given a 7'6" long aluminium tub sort of a thing. It was called tub. It had been a hydroplane, but the owner had built a new boat and take the engine off it, and it was the nearest modern equivalent as an optimist dinghy. But first sail was a bed sheet, and my mother taught me to use the sewing machine, and so then that wasn't big enough, so I made a jib out of a pillowcase. The mast was held up with string, and I sort of learnt stick and string literally that way. So age 12, my dad took me to the boat show at Earl's Court in London, and there was John Morwood starting up the AYRS, had a stand there, had a most interesting talk. And my dad was a bit of an inventor. In the winter he used to build folding canvas canoes. He built slalom canoes, and each one folded up in a slightly different way. He was always improving, inventing. So he joined the AYRS on my behalf, and the publications started coming out of catamarans and trimarans and hydrofoils and self-steering gears. Age 13, I built my first canoe. It was a canvas-covered one, 7'6" long, and by 15, I built a sliding seat sailing canoe, a sort of poor man's 10 square meter. And we'll go over to the share screen at this stage, I think. So yes, it's Lake Windermere from Gummer's How, the mountain just behind where we are. If any of you have been up there, you might see the slides wrong way around. A friend of mine did the copying. Yeah, I was the founding secretary of South Windermere Sailing Club. There were a whole bunch of boats cruising around, having fun. None of them, no two alike. And so I got to sail in all kinds of different boats, and I had these sliding seat canoes which would beat anything inside if you could keep them upright. But in the fickle winds of the lake, that was quite an athletic procedure. Sometimes capsize 3 times and still win a race with a bit of luck. Something. Came the time to leave school and find a career. My father insisted I get a trade at least. I wouldn't go to university. I'd had it with study. So I spent 5 years apprenticeship at Vickers Shipbuilders in Barrow-in-Furness as a ship draftsman, and I hated it. It was just a drudgery. You were nobody in a sea of nobodies. And halfway through, I was ready to give up. I wanted to start and try and boat build on my own, but I didn't know anybody, had no ideas. My father insisted I carry on. In those days, of course, you were under his thumb to age 21. So I carried on, but I said, right, when I'm through with this, I'm off. And I had read, of course, Arthur Piver's exploits crossing the Atlantic in the first trimaran. And I knew Pat Patterson, who later became well known for his Heavenly Twins catamarans. He had crossed the Atlantic in a Piver Nimble. And there was a 24-foot nugget lying on the beach down at Roe Island near Barrow-in-Furness. And I walked around and around it, and was inspired by this, because no way I could build a conventional boat. I could never afford the timber and the lead for the keel. I didn't have the skills, but I figured I could build a trimaran. So I figured if you took a nugget 24-footer, which was really a day sailor, and fattened it out a little bit, you could have a boat with minimum expense, minimum size, which could cross the oceans. And so Klis was built in my spare time on an apprentice's wage. She cost £400 altogether. I remember my starting wage as an apprentice was £4, 8 shillings and 2pence, and that wasn't enough to buy the petrol, to get to work virtually. So it was very much a budget boat. Built a 1/4-inch ply, and I glassed her up to the waterline with polyester at the time. That was as much as I could do. By then, I never wanted to look at fiberglass again. My sister never forgave me for roping her in at the expense. She was originally launched on the lake, Windermere, and pretty soon ran out of water. We could cover the end of the lake in no time. So still unfinished, she was unbolted and transported in pieces down to the Roe Island near Barrow in Furness, where I assembled her again. And the last year of my apprenticeship, the draftsman was sent down the shipyard to go around all the trades and spend time with each of the trades. So I didn't have to dress up with a suit and tie in the mornings anymore. So I lived on my boat in Walney Channel near Barrow and commuted there with the idea of saving travelling expenses. However, it was so cold living in the winter there. I had a tilly lamp inside to keep warm, a kerosene heater. But the condensation froze on the inside of the cabin, and I had icicles inside the boat, and the moisture soaked right through the plywood and brought all the paint off the top sides. So come spring, I had to repaint it. So I didn't really gain anything from living aboard over the winter. But in the shipyard holidays, we had 2 weeks of freedom in the year. Myself and 2 boys took her across to the Isle of Man and over to Larne in Northern Ireland, down to Dunleary and back again in the 2 weeks. And I figured that tested her out sufficiently. And so once I finished my time there, I worked a couple of weeks just to show I hadn't been fired, and then set off for the West Indies. Had charts as far as the West Indies. The boat was loaded up with food, as much as you could carry. In those days, you were allowed to take 50 pounds with you. There were currency restrictions, and I think I had another 100 in the bank probably. So that was all we had. It was October by the time I left, and had a stormy passage to the Isle of Man, where I waited 5 days while it blew and rained and was horrible. Pretty rough passage down to Dunleary. Got becalmed in a calm and fog just outside the harbour, and worked my way down the coast of Ireland, where I got caught in a gale on a lee shore. I spent a day or two in Arklow, which was really quite pleasant. Met John Tyrrell there, the boat builder, and had a glimpse of Ireland. And then carried on down towards the Scilly Islands. I had 2 gales in 3 days heading down to the Scillies. This is the route I planned, down to as far as the Canary Islands. Got into the Scilly Islands very much relieved, and had some problems with the boat as I was running in the big seas. They started pounding under the wing deck and opened up the joint between the wing deck and the hull and started water squirting in. So in the Scillies, I strengthened her up a bit and re-glued the seams on the deck. And the locals were very friendly in Hughtown, let me use a greenhouse to dry out all my belongings, and was able to have a look around the island a little bit at the same time while I was there, basically waiting for a weather window to get cracking. So this was a reminder to be careful. These are all figureheads of sailing ships that have been wrecked on the Scilly Islands in the museum there. I gather some of you have been out there and had a look around. And well, that one hasn't come out right. It's a Spanish lady when it's supposed to be. So eventually got a fair wind, a decent forecast and a fair wind. It was middle of October by now, but as I went for it, I pushed off heading for La Coruña in northern Spain. For a while all went well, but I was trying to make the old self-steering system where you have twin staysails with the sheets hitched onto the tiller so that the boat basically was dynamically stable. This worked for Hiscock and his Wanderer and various keel boats, but I found on the little trimaran it oversteered wildly and it really wasn't very practical at all. So I was, to make decent time, I had to hand steer, and all went well for a couple of days, and the wind started getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and I was down to just a jib and surfing down the waves, and we found here that the try would really go, as Piver said, you can make good speed down the waves. You'd get up to 12 knots or more surfing down a wave, and then the wave overtook you and you're down to about 4 or 5 knots. But I was on the helm for 24 hours and getting really tired, and the wind got stronger and stronger. finally a big wave, bigger than the rest, came along, and we took off down it and broached to violently, and the wave broke at the same instant. It threw her over to, I estimate, about 80 degrees heel, and threw her sideways. Luckily, I didn't have my dugger boards down, and mercifully dropped upright again. It was the scariest moment of my life, and I realized I've been very lucky, actually. But you know, young men take risks. Anyway, after that, I lay a hull, just beam onto the seas, and crossed a large part of Biscay, going sideways at 2 knots, right through the shipping lane. The Tilly lamp was out of action. It got full of salt water, and the radar reflector, I had a cheap ex-military thing, that blew away. And there were ships all around going pum, 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 pum with a propeller, which in the middle of the night was not a nice surrounding. Anyway, eventually it cleared up, and luckily the wind stayed fair, and I made it into La Coruña. Here I met an old Colin Archer boat with a young family on board, the Ho-Ho. They were also heading for the West Indies, so there was a man and his wife and a little girl, about 8 years old. So quickly made friends, and moored alongside and climbed up his mast to take this photo of the boat drying out. Waited in La Coruña while a Force 11 went past, and then pushed off out again into enormous ground swells. You kind of had to change gear going up those swells, it felt like. And got around Cape Finisterre and down did a bit of coasting down the northwest coast of Spain, but I didn't have proper charts. I found my way into Vigo, where I found more boats heading the same way, great camaraderie, and from there on down to Lisbon was the next port. In Lisbon, I had a great time in the crowded yacht harbour there. There were more boats to meet up with, all heading across the Atlantic. Just outside the harbour were these fregatas, the old sailing barges. Still a few of them left there. This one was just barely stemming the tide, and the guy under the mainsail there was pumping to keep it dry. Apparently had a cargo of dried fish, and there were some ribald comments about the smell. And yeah, there were also some other yachties on another boat that took me out on the town in Lisbon, and I had a bit of an experience of nightlife in the city, which was really quite an eye-opener, I must say. This was another yacht, American yacht, Kismet, who was on the last stage of a circumnavigation around the world. I got friendly with the crew, 2 couples. The 2 girls were cousins, I think. They were very close, and they just had a ball, and they regaled me with stories of Tahiti and the South Seas and Bali and Indonesia and all these wonderful places, and kind of further my resolve after the West Indies, I might go further. I'm just going to put my heater on. Yeah, so there were modifications in Lisbon. The galvanized iron hoop around the stern, which doubles as a main sheet horse, was a very desirable addition to give me some protection. The lifeline that goes forward. Incidentally, the canvas dodgers there, they were ex-military hammocks off troop ships. In Barrow in Furness, there were troop ships being demolished. My father took me down there while he bought some timber to make bunks for us and various things. You could get flax awning canvas for £1 a square yard, and hammocks here, they were £1 each. And so it was a cheap source of canvas. They were flax, yeah. And that was a big improvement that we made in putting those around the stern there. Pushed on then towards Las Palmas. All the yachters agreed to meet in Las Palmas for Christmas, so it was December by this time. And nice quiet trip out there where I tried to get a handle on the celestial navigation. Up to this point, I'd bought a sextant for £5 off a mate, and it was an old brass one, and I was trying to learn to use it along the way. And for tables, I had Reed's Nautical Almanac, which has a system in it there for celestial navigation, but I later found out that it's really a very difficult system to work. It's much abbreviated and involves a lot of interpolation, and I was struggling with it, but managing something. And eventually found Gran Canaria. And here, another Colin Archer, this time a French guy with a family on board, so 2 boys as well. And so the French and the English Colin Archers became rivals immediately, of course. And great camaraderie here. We all realized the need for self-steering gears, and I had the early AYRS publication on wind vane gears. And we clubbed together. I had some spare plywood, and one of the boats had some stainless steel, and the Erasme had an electric drill. And we all worked together making our self-steering gears for the Atlantic crossing. And also a great deal of partying, of course, going on there. And yeah, I found wonderful people, all a bit eccentric, of course. And the friendships there were because I was alone, it was really yeah, valuable to have these friendships. All along here, I wasn't going alone as a matter of principle. It's just nobody else wanted to come with me. Many years later, I kind of realized how it was I wasn't able to form, you know, good relationships with girls, particularly lasting relationships. But eventually came the day, and fair wind, well, decent. There weren't any forecasts at that stage. We decided, right, here goes. And Ho and Erasme had to have a race, of course. So they set off together in a flat calm. And so one turned on the engine, so the other turned on the engine. So they sort of motored out to the harbour in bits and pieces. It was interesting. They were looking down on the Klis and frowning. Here were the ultimate safe, seaworthy Colin Archer pilot cutter sailing ships. The Ho was lost in a hurricane a year or 2 later near Harvest Island in the West Indies at sea. And the Erasme ran on a reef in the Bahamas and was wrecked. And I had my share of adventures, but I got where I wanted to go. So it's not just yeah, ships that are seaworthy, it's people as well. Second day out, met up with a German yacht, the Raireva, who had left just after me and motored through the night. This is the typical twin running sails they'd set up, and the self-steering gear they'd got going. And they were just trickling along, and I had full main and genoa, so I left them hull down behind me by midnight. We could surf on this trade wind swells. I had twin spinnakers I set up. They were odd-sized sails. One was a cotton mainsail off a Windermere class yacht that had been given to me, and the other had my #1 genoa. That was for light winds. Then you could gradually change them down. They didn't have to be equal area. And here's Fred, my self-steering gear. It was a trim tab on the back of the rudder, directly connected through a bit of aluminium tubing to the shaft and a vane. And to alter course, you took a screwdriver and unloosened a hose clamp, twisted the vane around into the wind and tightened it up again. It worked, but you had to have check lines on the tiller. It tended to oversteer because of it being mounted directly on the rudder. As the rudder turned, it turned the vane as well in the wrong direction. And so yeah, it was just basically working. But as you can see, we were getting along there. We could surf down the waves. The old sunlog would go up to 12 knots sometimes down a wave, and then you drop back to 5 or 6. And she was steering straight and running well, and yeah, made good time. Some calmer days were really very pleasant. And about the 8th day, the wind blew up really quite strong, and just at dusk, Fred broke in half. And so I had to, it was blowing by this time, good force 6, maybe gusting 7. So I just lay a hull for the night, and in the morning managed to fix him up and carry on. There was one stage where the wind was getting steadily stronger and stronger, and we were surfing faster and faster down the waves until it was getting rather alarming. I was lying in my bunk, sort of fully in tune with the boat, listening to the waves roaring past. And I got up to make some dinner and just opened a tin of curry when she took off down a wave. And I guess she might have gone up to about 15 knots or so. And the wave sort of carried on with the wave and then overtook the wave and dived down and stuffed her nose into the wave in front and stopped dead. I shut up on deck and found that the jib halyard block had disintegrated and dropped the Genoa for me. So lay a hull for the night. So I had a job which I funked very much the next morning of going up the mast to hitch on a new halyard block, or else trickle along on the mainsail only, one headsail for the rest of the trip. So I trailed the warp out astern and left her just trickling along downwind. Lying beam on was much too violent motion, and clinging on for dear life, and sort of shinned up the mast and hooked on a new halyard block and was able to get going again. After that, there were more days of really lovely sailing, but I was feeling very lonely at the time, and was you know, wishing for company. I had a go at reading through the Bible, but got on the Revelations and stuff like that, and I thought, hey, hang on, this is some medieval monk having a big rant. It's not God's word at all. So yeah, there was not really any real comfort there, but just wanted to get the other side and meet up with my mates again. So we pushed on, and the last evening before I was due to sight Barbados, thread finally disintegrated. So I took the helm, and for 24 hours we ran 180 miles. That's nearly 7-8 knots average, and that was my best day's run. And we made it into Barbados just under 20 days, which knocked 4 days off the previous record. That was held by Bill Howells in Stardrift. And funnily enough, Stardrift was coming across again with a new owner, and he shipped a crew at the last minute, a very nice young lady, and they did it in 26 days this time. So finally in Barbados I arrived, but then where were all my friends? They hadn't turned up yet. But fortunately, a couple of guys rowed out from the local sailing club and said, hey, would you like to come ashore for a beer? And that was really very, very welcome indeed. Meanwhile, there's Ho-Ho and Erasme arrived, and the sailing dinghy here are the two boys off Erasme learning to sail, and they were on correspondence school from France. And I was very impressed with them. They kind of spoke like adults, and you could really have a conversation with them. And it sort of gave me ideas for when I might have children of my own one day. So yeah, great times partying in Erasme. This boat, the Norlandia, was owned by a guy who came from Bolton, which is quite near where I lived in northern England. And he'd come across with a hippie crew, and they'd all jumped ship, and he was just sitting there and wondering how to make some money and living. But meanwhile, she was the party boat, and Klis became the dinghy. Friends from another yacht here, we discovered snorkeling, and found with Klis 1'6" draft, we could sail her across the coral reefs, which were about 3 feet deep mostly, and tow behind with a mask and snorkel on at 2 or 3 knots, and have a most wonderful view of the coral gardens, this sort of thing. It was great sport. So looking what to do next, there was the plans were to sail around the West Indies until the money ran out, and a Swedish boy joined up with me. He had crossed on another yacht. This is Bjorn Mathiasen, and they were heading straight for the Bahamas, and he wanted to look around. So he's an artist, did watercolors, and almost every day he would paint another watercolor. So the budget was $1 a day each, and we set off to cruise the West Indies. You can see there, down in the bottom corner is Barbados. We went first down to Tobago, where we had a great time. Then down to Trinidad, up to Grenada and through the Grenadines, and then right through the Windward Islands, the chain of Windward Islands. 26 islands in 4 months. We're living on a lot of bananas and some fish we caught and so on. This was off Barbados, met this local fishing boat here. He says, "Hi, Mom." They went past. Still fishing under sail there. We found that Tobago Island, this was really quite primitive, but there was an American summer camp on the eastern end of the island, Camp Crusoe, where we came in and anchored, and were welcomed in by the locals and the American couple who were running it. Just had a great time snorkeling and partying. Further down, the villagers still hauling the net, traditional style there. It was really quite unspoilt. Eventually, the customs caught up with us, and we hadn't gone to the capital and cleared customs, because that would have involved a hell of a slog back to windward. So we were in serious trouble for that, and told that we had to get away pretty soon. I didn't have any photos of Trinidad. It was hot and steamy down there. We spent some time exploring the Corona swamps, where there are four-eyed fishes and things. I should have had more photos, but this is into Grenada, Lancipil, in the south coast of Grenada. The dark trimaran up in the top right there is Triptych. She was a 65-foot piver, at the time the biggest trimaran in the world. We were among the smallest, and we went alongside, and they were doing charter work. Most of these boats were doing chartering, and that was opened my eyes to new possibilities of making a living under sail.
What year was this, Bernard?
This was 66.
Oh,
yeah, and the Christmas of 66, now early 67, I guess. Yeah. So in the Tobago Keys in the West Indies, north of Grenada, a bunch of small islands with coral reefs all around. Finally got the chance to jump in the dinghy and get a picture of Klis under sail. And so Bjorn buzzed up and down while I took photographs.
Mm-hmm.
There she is. This was a trade we did. A young couple from South Africa on a 50-odd foot keel boat needed the bottom of the boat scrubbing, and they had a hookah type thing. So Bjorn and I scrubbed the bottom, and in return we got our hair cut. That was the deal. So, Bequi in the Grenadine Islands, the most interesting place, where there's a strong tradition of shipbuilding and whaling, which came down from the east coast of the States, New Bedford and around there. Everybody seemed to be connected to the sea. Beautiful place. They had these whale boats. These were the slightly smaller ones, used for pilot fishing. They used to load the boat with rock stone ballast, and use the ballast to help them sail to windward. Then coming home, they threw the stones overboard. They hadn't caught a whale in 3 years when I was there, but when they did catch a whale, it would feed the whole island for a month or more. And so they were still hunting. But meanwhile, they also raced these boats as well. They're actually sprit rigged, and that's just the sail drying up at the moment. Heading out. He had a Calypso song going, whaler man, what is your luck? A wet backside and a hungry gut. And it's sort of, yeah. Building a schooner on the beach there. The frames were grown locally, and the planking came from South America. And it's all done by hand and all done by eye. They'd inherited the traditions from up in the United States, I think, yeah. Really, some of the frames looked a bit rough. Apparently, they would last about 10 or 15 years before they started leaking seriously. And the really good, well-built schooner would last 20, 25 years, something like that. They were launched without any engine in them, and would sail around till they'd earned enough money to buy a motor. And after that, the topmasts came down, and they became motor sailors. And this is how they were built, basically. There's an old guy with an axe just chopping away, bit by bit. It was amazing, the amount of labor. I read in the yachting magazines that they've built a replica of the native sloop in Carriacou recently, just to keep the traditions alive. It's not completely gone. Yeah.
When I was in that Eastern Caribbean in the early 80s, they still had trading schooners bringing in
yes,
vegetables and things from the Grenadines, and up the islands. If you're in Trinidad, where I was, down the islands went towards Venezuela. Up the islands was Grenadines and Grenada, St. Vincent, and they would bring in these vegetables in these things, these schooners still.
Yeah. Who was that talking? I didn't see.
Sorry, it's Charles, CRM man there.
Yeah.
Okay, my internet's playing up, so I'm on the phone, so I'm trying to keep the bandwidth as little as possible. That's why you're not seeing a photo.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes, thanks. This was in St. Vincent. There are botanical gardens there. The most interesting tropical flowers and plants. This is a traveler's palm. If you stick a knife into the trunk, then water comes out. You can drink it. and that's unusual. It's been raining, and the leaves catch the rain and funnel it direct into the. We've got some surface there that obviously repels water. I don't know what it was made of. But nature is really quite wonderful. This is a breadfruit tree that was planted by Captain Bligh when, as it's well known, his first attempt to bring breadfruit back from Tahiti to the West Indies ended up in the mutiny on the Bounty, and Captain Bligh being cast adrift in his ship's launch, 23-foot launch, and an epic voyage he made back to Timor and back to England. He had a second go, and the second time round he was successful. And the idea was the breadfruit would be the ideal food for the slaves in the West Indies and the sugar plantations. And he finally got it there, and the slaves refused to touch the stuff. And it wasn't really a very good financial success. But the breadfruit tree he planted is still growing in this garden in St. Vincent. Further north along the coast of St. Vincent, very wild at the time and primitive, there was this. We just anchored off the beach for the night once, and there was this one guy living by himself with just a fishing boat and a net and a veggie patch in the garden. And he was happy as Larry, just keeping clear of all the politics going on, and very interesting to talk to him, just a bit in the ultimate simplicity of living, really. The French island of Martinique, where we anchored across the bay, most of the cruising yachts, and the contrast to the British Islands was startling. The formerly British Islands, newly independent, were really poverty-stricken and struggling with somewhat corrupt administrations and trouble with customs and so on. The French Islands are part of France and subsidised heavily, obviously, and are really quite wealthy, and there are supermarkets and lots of cars and really quite modern. Klis got used as a water taxi backwards and forwards. It was a nice beam reach for about 3 miles from our anchorage to the town to go shopping. So we'd go around and pick up people from the other yachts and sail across and do our shopping and sail back again. And this repaid the hospitality I enjoyed on many of the other boats. So that often get invited to dinner and eat up the leftovers, sort of thing. Bulbous bows are nothing new. These are the gommiers, they're called the dugout canoes, which hollowed out of a single log. In former times, the bows were used for ramming each other in warfare. Up until before I was there, they were under sail. They had a big sprit sail, which was set up well forward. And obviously, this gave them some grip on the water. Nowadays, they're a big outboard on the back, and they're the local taxis zooming around Martinique and also Dominica as well. They're similar type craft. It's the ruins of the city of Saint Pierre, northern part of Martinique, that was destroyed by a volcano in 1903. This was the theatre, and there was a cloud of incandescent gas just rolled down the hillside and wiped the city out in one fell swoop. There was only one survivor, and he was a prisoner who was in an underground cell. And he was still alive there as the guardian of the city and the curator of the sort of museum, such as it was. Yeah, must have been a scary time. Passages between the islands, the trade wind funnels through between the islands in the West Indies and blows really quite hard. It's 25, 30 knots. Klis is sailing hard here. The hatches into the floats leaked abominably, and so after a couple of hours of sailing like this, we'd have to heave to on the other tack and bail out the float and then swing around and get going again. Also the cross beams where they were bolted into the cabin, they leaked, despite all my attempts to cure them. So it was quite a sort of hairy sailing going between, but fortunately you could do the passage in one day. This, in Dominica, there's a river that flows through the jungle and down into the sea. You can get up into quite a long way in the dinghy. So yeah, suddenly it was like going into the depths of Africa with these enormous buttress roots. And we took our washing up to get it clean in fresh water there. Martinique, Guadeloupe Island rather, is 2 islands joined by a bridge over across a very narrow channel. to sail around the lee side involves a long trip in very light variable winds, followed by a hard slog to windward to get up to Antigua. So we, the bridge across them used to open, but it got damaged in a hurricane, and it didn't open anymore. So we sailed up to it and used it to lift the mast out and pulled her through, and then stepped the mast on the other side. And so we were the only yacht that year to go through the middle of Guadeloupe. I believe the bridge has opened again. If somebody can let me know there, but it's since been repaired. And so we're into English Harbour in Antigua, which of course is a fascinating place. Nelson's old dockyard is there, and there were it was bustling with charter yachts, and there was work to be had, sort of varnishing and painting on these boats and so on, and parties to be had in the Admiral's Inn as well. Beautiful charter yachts. This was one called Lord Jim, which sailed into the harbour while we were there. I dropped the sails and anchored and moored up stern to the dock without using their engine. Had a crew of 7, and they took pride in working the boats under sail alone, which was really beautiful to see. This is how you clean the bottom in Antigua, by careening. The local sloops are all inside ballast, so they take all the ballast out of them and then heave them down, and they can get at the keel to repair the damages from the tornado worm and cork them all up. These local native sloops, nominally used for fishing, but in fact used mainly for smuggling. There were several free ports in the islands, and other places had quite heavy duty on their booze. And so it was quite a sort of underground industry. It's still smuggling whiskey and rum up and down the islands there. This was St. Bart's, which is, I think, half Dutch, half French, wasn't it? Was that one? Yeah. But the rum here was $7 for a case of 12 Mount Gay rum. We had $14 left, so half our budget went on a case of rum. It was the rum was cheaper than the Coke there. It was amazing, and a very pleasant place. Yeah, it's since got very highly developed for the tourist charter boat industry. By this time, yeah, funds were getting really seriously low. But luckily, I've been in correspondence with Dick Newick, who was living in St. Croix in the US Virgin Islands at the time, and he said there may well be work for me when I got there. So that was my target place. Really heading on. We visited the island of Saba, which is a 3 miles diameter volcano and 3,000 feet high. And the village is called Bottom, and it's 900 feet up from the sea level in the crater of the volcano. It's mainly Dutch people and descendants live here, and mainly white, and a very fascinating place. It was somewhat depopulated. All the young ladies that were famous for the beauty were away training to be nurses down in Curacao and Bonaire and the other Dutch islands. But we anchored off it and climbed some 900 steps to get up there. But it was noted that the people there, many of them lived to a ripe old age, and they just were subsistence farmers, basically. They built all their own roads from this landing place up to the island, and they built themselves an airstrip as well where a twin otter could land. And so the anchorage wasn't very secure, but luckily I had a very big anchor, so I left Klis and took the risk and spent a couple of days there looking around. Right now, the place I live in New Zealand is up a steep driveway, which helps hopefully keep me alive a bit longer. I think the climbing up and down the hills was probably good for people, and certainly the healthy diet they lived in, all organic food and clean air and so on, are probably contributing factors to them living such a long age. In the Virgin Islands, there's an area known as the Baths, where there are enormous great rocks have been deposited in historic times, and you can climb, wander in and out amongst them there. Fascinating place, and that's Bjorn doing one of his paintings. So that was the end of our cruise. We started in St. Thomas in the US Virgin Islands, got some work on another charter yacht, and I've lost touch with him now. So I sailed across to St. Croix, where Dick Newick was in the early planning stages of building the Cheers. This was a radical proa, 40-foot long, with the armour to leeward, the float to leeward, but the two hulls were identical in shape. And I got at the stage where he was just starting to build it, so I helped him fare the lines for it, and worked with Wally Galloway, the West Indian guy standing next to me there, for 6 months building the Cheers, which was 3 skins of 1/8" mahogany moulded plywood. And we worked in a tin roof shed. It was sweltering hot, but it was very interesting work, and I learnt a lot from Dick. And here was launching day. As Cheers in her original form. She sailed like anything. The acceleration when you sheeted in was enough to tip you overboard if you weren't hanging on. And she later, Tom Follett was the skipper of her, and she broke new ground in terms of simplicity of ocean cruises. The hull that he lived in was 27 inches wide, and one end was a bunk and the other end was a table, and it had a little camping stove and just a trolley full of goods from the supermarket, and that was his stores across the Atlantic. She sailed over to England, where initially they were doubtful about letting her into the race until it was pointed out that she was proven ocean worthy, and Colin Muder inspected her and said, yeah, this boat's in sound condition. She was allowed to enter the race, and she came third after the Club Mediterranee and another enormous boat. She cost about a hundredth of what the 2 boats ahead of her cost. And she was in the Exeter Maritime Museum for many years, but I saw her there in 1989 in rather decrepit condition. But since then, the French have got hold of her, and they've got her sailing again, I believe, and looking after her there. Yeah. So yeah, a very interesting project, and it made me enough money to refit the Klis. And she is belting along at speed. She actually capsized during her trials. Cheers. Tom was asleep below in the lee of Guadalupe Island, and a gust came down, and the boat turned round with the armour to windward, which was wrong way around, and it flipped her over. She landed on her masts and luckily didn't go upside down. And he was rescued by a steamer, and they came in and later built a big blister on the windward side to prevent that ever happening again. And if it ever did, it would tip her back up again. So anyway, by this time, Klis was pretty much a wreck. She'd been built on the cheap, and she leaked all over. And so I was able to haul out on a little island in the middle of the harbour in St. Croix, in the Virgin Islands, in Christiansted, and Buck Island. Protestant Key it was called, that's right. And I stripped her down to bare wood and fiberglassed her all over, actually not using glass but epoxy and a polypropylene cloth which we'd been using on the Cheers. And I glassed the cross beams in solid and built the bridge deck in solid and rebuilt the float hatches, and generally made her a great deal more seaworthy than she had been. And was planning heading further along. A big breakthrough came when I got hold of a set of charts for the whole Pacific Ocean right down to New Zealand for $25 off a big American yacht that had just finished the circumnavigation. So I was working towards heading south, but this probably is a place to pause there. I don't know how we're going for time. I thought I sort of planned the talk to go this far and then give people time for discussion. This is the carnival time in St. Croix, and the music of the steel bands was there every day. Really quite wonderful music. They actually play classical numbers on these beat out oil drums and so on. And carnival time, the whole place goes wild. There's Miss St. Croix in 1968, I think it was. So there were good times to be had in St. Croix while I was refitting the boat, and finally got ready for the next stage and could plan as far as New Zealand. So I pause it there, and back to you, Kim, and you want to see what questions there are. I'll take the discussion any way it wants to go.
Yeah, I don't know what anybody else thinks, but I'm absolutely enchanted. It's a fantastic story. I'm so pleased you were able to share it with us. Anybody? I can't see. Oh, yes, Slade.
Slade.
Could you tell us roughly how long the whole trip took?
Yeah, it was about altogether about 3 years. About half of the time was spent working at different places. Nearly a year in St. Croix with Dick Newick, and as I went along in Tahiti, I got odd jobs, and then the Cook Islands, all kinds of different jobs to make a bit of dough along the way. But it was always a scrape financially. Yeah. Mm. I regarded that as my university education, with the world as a campus, and at that stage a lot of my mates were doing apprenticeships and going to university, sort of thing. And yeah.
Anyway,
Do you feel you could have done the same thing if you hadn't done the apprenticeship beforehand?
Well, that gave me the incentive to leave, to get the hell out of there. I knew what I didn't want, and working to see any of the prospects for myself in the north of England. Much later I realised if I'd had good contacts in the south coast of England, I might well have found myself a career in yachting and sailing and boats. And I dreamed of making a living at yacht design, but as you know, practically nobody has done that. It's just there was no such thing as business plans in those days, and advanced budgeting, and you realise the amount of work that goes into a set of plans and the amount of money you get for it is just doesn't add up.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah.
yes, I can. Hi, Paul.
I think you are not the only person who wanted to get out of Vickers. It's people there all building multi-hulls. You mentioned Pat Patterson as a friend.
Yeah.
Was he working there?
No, he didn't work at Vickers. He was a teacher, that's right, but then retired from that. And then he, after he'd crossed the Atlantic in a nimble try, and incidentally he was dismasted partway across, and they restepped the mast by using the rolling of the boat to lever the mast up sideways, which was an advantage of trimarans. But he had a business selling kit sets for private trimarans. He sold me the timber I used to build Klis, Oregon pine there, and he sort of went alternative, and then gradually got into yacht design, and yeah, they settled on the south coast and with the Heavenly Twins. Yeah.
Did James Warren work there?
I never met James until he was in New Zealand a few years ago on his way around the world with the Gaia. Yeah. But of course I read his book, The Two Girls, Two Catamarans, and yeah.
Yes. Do you know a man called Dick Croix?
Yeah, he was an apprentice at the same time as I was. We were close friends. There was a bunch of us that used to race dinghies at Roe Island there, and he later they set off in a private trimaran with him and his brother, the Dream Machine, but then split up in the Canary Islands, and his brother sailed on to New Zealand. Dick went back, and then he built Mudslide Slim, which was a very, very nice trimaran of his own design. I think he's still living on the North Shore in Auckland here, but I've lost touch with him in recent years.
Yes. Was Ernie Diamond also working for Vickers?
Yeah, fond memories. Yeah, he was a real character. Yeah, Ernie designed and built his own catamaran. He built the first one was about 20 foot, then he did a 24-footer. And yeah, I sailed on his 20-footer, and we were all good friends down at Roe Island at the time. Yeah.
So it was based around Roe Island and not necessarily in the works itself. I got the impression that the actual works itself was, if you like, the hothouse connection point, and that a number of people were, if you like, intent on getting out by building themselves multi-hulls to actually sail away in the James Warren style.
Yeah.
Something like you are also hinting at. Yes,
there were quite a few who built their own boats and crossed to the West Indies, at least that far. I suppose it's one thing that Vickers did and the submarine work did was to inspire people to go and do other things. Yeah, yeah, to get out of there as soon as possible.
Where is Klis 1 now?
Where is which?
Klis 1.
Oh, I sold her in New Zealand, and she went through many owners. Several families learnt to sail on her, but she was wrecked about 10 years, 15 years ago in Auckland. She'd fallen on hard times, was owned by a guy who was on the dole, living on a neighbouring island, and he didn't do the maintenance. And I saw her, and I didn't want the job of fixing her up. She was made with the Aerolite 306 glue, the urea formaldehyde glues, which after a few years goes really brittle. So all the glue joints were basically cracked, and she was in a bad way. I wouldn't have wanted the job to try and restore her. But yeah, he sailed into town to do some work and borrowed a mooring without asking, and the mooring broke and she went up on the rocks. So she had a good innings anyway, good life. But yeah, by the time I got to New Zealand, I knew what I wanted, and there'd been big advances in multi-hull design. So I built Klis 2 in Auckland, and I used good quality materials this time. She's 23 feet long and 17 foot beam. The original one was 14-foot beam, slightly bigger floats, and open wing decks on the side. And when I got married, she was the only asset I had, and she wasn't even finished at that stage. And we sailed around for a year or two looking for a place to settle, discovered Waiheke Island, and I sold the boat, and it was enough to buy this half-acre of land and put up a shed. And many years later, the boat belonged to a friend of mine, and he wasn't doing the maintenance, and I was on to his case, so he gave me a half share in it, which meant that I got to do the work, doing the maintenance. So eventually I bought him out, and I still have her here. And yeah, got some. We've experimented with hydrofoils for motion damping, L-shaped foils in the floats, and the inverted T-foil on the rudder. And it definitely smoothed out the motion a great deal. But for racing, the Wednesday night racing, these foils, in light winds, they were just pure drag or running downwind. So I made a pair of racing dagger boards, asymmetric foils. But just yesterday, I dug out the old foils. I'm going to put them back in again. I think not so much into racing anymore, and perhaps I'll use some more with the easy motion of foil stabilizing. Yeah.
Oh, lovely. So anybody else have any more questions? Slade?
It sounds as though your apprenticeship was very important, but you could, if you hadn't had that skill, to be rebuilding several boats.
Yeah.
With the whole
Nearly all the yacht design I learnt as a keen amateur and through the AYRS. There were formal courses in naval architecture because we had to do night school and the day release courses, which was so utterly boring. It was 3 hours of learning Lloyd's rules by rote, how to design a watertight bulkhead in a passenger ship. They were no longer building passenger ships, of course, at that stage. So, yeah, taught by journeyman draftsmen, and it was just utterly boring. There was one section that was really useful, and that was on strength of materials and beam theory, that engineering design. That was really useful in designing the cross beams and so on of the boat. Yeah, but for the most part, what I learnt on my own and from my dad and from observing other boats and sailing other boats. Yeah.
Lovely.
Most interesting, thanks.
I think, folks, we've done our hour. Thank you very, very much indeed, Bernard, for a superb talk. And it'll be the same time, same place next Saturday then, if that's okay.
Yeah, okay. Next Sunday morning here. We're ahead of you.
Sunday morning, yes.
13 hours ahead of you.
Time traveling, aren't you?
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah, I'll do that, sure. And yeah, good sailing to everybody there.